All right, thank you to everyone who is joining us. We have a few announcements as everyone joins. And so first, we are recording this session and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question during this session, please use the Q&A area in Whova to the right of your screen. The chat window is where you can engage with other attendees. And we kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentations and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and microphones on. It looks like we're getting ready to get started, so I'm going to hand it over to Becky to begin our time.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this special session, Getting into the Weeds, Fire, Invasive Plants, and Disturbance Interactions. I'm going to be announcing our first speaker, who is Nietupski, who's going to be speaking about annual grass invasion in association with large wildfires in the interior northwestern U.S.
Thank you for the introduction, Becky. Like Becky mentioned, my name is Nietupski. I'm currently working as an ORISE postdoc at the Pacific Northwest Research Station here in Corvallis, Oregon. And as she also mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit about my research on an annual grass invasion in the interior Pacific Northwest and its relationship with wildfire. So first, I'd like to give a little bit of background on our species of interest here. We're looking at Betnata dubia, and I'd like to talk a little bit about why its invasion in particular is concerning. Betnata is a winter annual grass native to Mediterranean Eurasia and was first documented in eastern Washington in the 1950s. Since its introduction, it's spread to 8 western states, and it's present in a variety of plant communities in the interior West, but it's been observed in high abundance in forest openings and in ecotones between shrubland and forested areas. One of the main concerns with the invasion of an annual grass species is the development of a grass fire cycle. And we've heard about this from other presenters so far during the conference, but cheatgrass invasion in particular in sagebrush steppe is one of the most widely known examples of the impacts of these fire cycles. And fire cycles can lead to pretty serious consequences, including ecosystem type conversion, habitat loss, alterations to nutrient cycling, and biodiversity loss. The invasion of Betnata in forest openings and along ecotones raises concerns for its potential impact to forest resilience. And some recent studies have highlighted the potential consequences of annual grass invasion in forested areas. So this figure here to the right just kind of conceptualizes the combined impact of the grass fire cycle with additional forces that are affecting forest resilience both positively and negatively. So while Betnata has spread to several western states, much of the heart of the invasion can be found in the Blue Mountains ecoregion, as seen here in this figure to the right, outlined in yellow. So the Blue Mountains ecoregion is located between the Cascade Range to the west and the Rockies to the east. And the mountains, valleys, and plateaus of this region host a wide range of plant communities that are oriented in a complex and varied spatial arrangement. But during the fire seasons of 2014 and 2015, Betnata was observed carrying fire through previously low biomass areas. And this accelerated interest in Betnata and its potential impact to ecosystems of the region. And furthermore, this unique fire behavior was observed in areas within the forest matrix. So given the potential impacts of grass-driven fire on forest ecosystems, we decided to investigate this invasion process for Betnata and its relationship to large wildfire events. So to look at the invasion process, we modeled the spatial distribution of Betnata over time at the ecoregional scale. We keyed into 2 important aspects or 2 characteristics of Betnata in modeling its distribution. First, winter invasive annual grass species have unique phenology when compared to some native species in ecosystems of the Western US. And this allowed us to key into differences in the patterns of phenology as observed from satellites. Second, research has indicated that Vetonata differs environmentally in its niche requirements or its niche space from other common invasives throughout the West, including cheatgrass and medusa head. So changes in the distribution of a species over time can provide us useful information about the invasion process itself. This information can be used to key into sources of propagules for future invasion, or it can give us an indication of the plant communities that are most vulnerable to invasion. So additionally, this change information can tell us where fuel conditions might be changing across the landscape, and we can use the same information to examine whether the invasion process has been influenced by disturbances like wildfire. So to examine the change in Vetonata's distribution over time, we modeled the present distribution of Vetonata using satellite-derived land surface phenology and environmental predictors, and then compared this to its past distribution. We accounted for the effect of climate on year-to-year variation in phenology, and we did this so that we could isolate the phenology exhibited by Vetonata. We selected a year from the past with similar weather conditions to the year on which we trained the model, which was 2017. We made this selection based on the climatic similarity between years using a drought severity index and RAWS weather station data. And we found that 2006 was most similar to 2017. And we felt like this could improve the transferability of a model trained in 2017. So you can see this on the figure to the left, where 2006 and 2017 are highlighted in gray. The top of this figure shows the time series of the drought severity index, and the bottom shows the similarity of the RAWS weather station data to 2017. Both of these years started in non-drought conditions and then transitioned to drought conditions later in the year. So we fit a random forest model with our phenology and niche-related predictors and predicted the distribution of Vetonata in each of the respective years. And an example of these can be seen on the right here, kind of visualized into probability classes. So we then used our understanding of the change in the distribution of Vetonata to examine how this related to large wildfires. And so to do this, we selected all the wildfires from the MTBS database that occurred between 2006 and 2017. So a total of 119 fires occurred during that period, and we grouped these based on the proportion of forest and non-forest vegetation types, and also the most abundant vegetation type. Within these fires, we quantified the average probability of Vetonata and compared this to the average probability of Vetonata in areas that did not experience one of these large wildfires. And so for these non-burned areas, we sampled with replacement from the remaining area of the ecoregion, and each of these non-wildfire samples was a square area about 7,000 hectares in size, which is the median size of those 119 fires. We also looked at how burn severity might affect the invasion of Vetonata within the wildfires. And we did this by quantifying burn severity as measured by RDMBR. And we evaluated the difference in burn severity at different Vetonata probability classes or change classes. So first, I'll review some of the changes that occurred in the distribution of Vetonata before getting into how these relate to the fires that occurred in 2016 and 2017. So based on our models, the Vetonata invasion increased from about 5% of the region's area to about 8% during this time frame. And in addition to this, the mean patch size increased by about 50%, and the total number of patches decreased. So this indicated to us that Vetonata was spreading more radially than discontinuously or through longer distance dispersal during this period. This region-wide trend in radial spread was not necessarily echoed in all areas, though. And in some forest areas where habitat was more fragmented, like this example here to the right, Starkey Experimental Forest, we saw patch sizes increasing, but also the number of patches also increasing. And so that's kind of a product of the orientation of that landscape. So in addition to the spatial changes that we saw in Betnata's distribution, we also saw that Betnata was increasing across the elevational gradient. To the right here in panel A is the entire elevational profile for the Blue Mountains ecoregion. Panels B and C zoom into the invaded range, and in these panels, you can see the expansion was occurring disproportionately at higher elevations, especially over 1,300 meters. And this increased invasion at higher elevations was echoed in the Betnata's association with potential natural vegetation types. And we found that persistent populations were found in upland shrub and juniper woodlands, while expansion was more common in dry ponderosa pine and xeric pine habitat. So our results from looking at the region-wide changes in the invasion suggest that Betnata has been predominantly spreading from existing patches, but has been moving upward in elevation into more forested areas and into these forest, non-forest kind of ecotones. So the question is, could this change be related to fire occurrence in these areas or severity? In our comparison between areas that experienced wildfire and those that did not, we saw that in general there was an increase in the probability of Betnata during this time period, regardless of whether wildfire occurred. However, there were some vegetation communities for which wildfire occurrence was associated with an increase in the mean percent change in the probability of Betnata. So these areas included areas with a high proportion of forest and non-forest mixtures that were dominated by woodlands, as well as forested areas that were dominated by dry forests or mixed conifer forests. Only two large wildfires occurred in the subalpine forests over this time period, and so this was the only veg community where the probability of Betnata actually decreased in the absence of fire. So within the large wildfires, we also examined the association between burn severity and the change in Betnata distribution. For simplicity, we binned the percent change in probability of Betnata into 6 classes, 2 representing a decrease and 4 representing an increase. You can see that in this figure to the right on the X and Y axes. Apart from the subalpine group, increased burn severity was associated with an increase in Betnata change class. And you can see that the average difference in median RD and BR between change classes increases with the distance between change classes. So what I mean by this is that you kind of see those darker, warmer or cooler tones along the diagonal, with warmer tones kind of trending towards the lower right-hand corner of each of those heat maps. And this effect was particularly evident in the forest, non-forest mixtures dominated by dry forest, and the forested areas dominated by dry forest and mixed conifer. Non-forest areas dominated by shrublands and woodlands, on the other hand, had a pretty small change in Betnata probability, in burn severity associated with an increase in Betnata probability. So we also examined the Canyon Creek complex as a case study. This wildfire occurred in 2015 in an area dominated by dry forest that also contained a mixture of many other vegetation types. This is kind of shown maybe here in panel A with some nape imagery. But in panels B and D, you can see that many of the areas where high severity wildfire occurred, in many of the areas where there was high severity wildfire, we also had a relatively large increase in the probability of Betnata. But this wasn't necessarily the case in all areas, and you can kind of see that in the southern portion of the of panel D. So expansion in particular was found near persistent patches within this area, and you can see that in panel C. And this expansion was more radial than discontinuous. And that's indicated by an increase in the patch size and a decrease in the number of patches. So this expansion wasn't necessarily, this is more consistent with the regional trend than it was with the kind of patterns that we saw in similar areas like the Starkey experimental forest, where they have this kind of complex mosaic of forest and non-forest patches together. So just to briefly get to some conclusions, it's important to remember that Ventonata's invasion is still at the early stages in many parts of the Blue Mountains. Thank you. And then while Ventonata has the potential to cause impacts across different vegetation types and along the elevational gradient, we found that more of the robust populations were occurring at higher elevations and in dry ponderosa pine and xeric pine vegetation types. These vegetation types are commonly present in the transition zone between more heavily forested and more shrub-dominated areas. And so an addition of fine fuels in this particular setting could have an impact on fire transmission, and it might be an important consideration for future forest and fire management moving forward. And then finally, while factors that influence the spread of Ventonata are many, we found that fire occurrence and severity may be impacting the invasion, particularly in certain settings. So with that, I will, I guess, open it up for any questions. Thank you. Oh, actually, before I stop, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody that contributed to this research, both individuals and organizations. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ty. I am looking now at both the chat and the questions, and I don't see anything. So we do have a few minutes. Please feel free to enter any questions in the chat section. I wanted to ask you something, Ty, and that is, so what have you thought about looking at how Ventonata could be potentially driving larger wildfires? And would you be able to do something like that with this data? Because you've kind of looked at one side of that coin, right?
Right, yeah. I wouldn't necessarily feel confident at looking at Ventonata's impact on these wildfires that have occurred in this time period, mainly because, like I kind of mentioned there towards the end, this invasion's still kind of at early stages. And so the amount of invaded area within this region was not necessarily really substantial at the beginning of this time period. I think that would be really something that'd be really interesting moving forward. And I think that there would be possibilities kind of to look at that in the future.
Great. Well, thank you. And I'd like to maybe remind folks that there are other talks where we actually look at that, but in a simulation perspective, particularly the last talk in this session, Claire Tortorelli will be presenting some results along those lines. So I am not seeing any Q&A, so I will just continue to monitor the chat and we'll just kind of hang out here in order to stay on timing with the other talks and sessions. We won't start our next talk until, well, for me, 10:20, and whatever time that is for wherever you are. So 20 after the hour, we will start our talk, which is Emily Fusco. Okay, why don't we go ahead and move on with our next talk, which is the human grass fire cycle, how people and invasives co-occur to drive fire regimes. And our speaker is Emily Fusco.
Hello, and thank you for coming to my talk, The Human Grass Fire Cycle, How People and Invasives Co-Occur to Drive Fire Regimes. My name is Emily Fusco, and I am an ORISE Fellow affiliated with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station, the Northwest Climate Hub, and the Western Wildland Environmental Threat Assessment Center. Today, I'm presenting a paper that I worked on as a postdoc at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Also working with me on this project are Jennifer Balch, Adam Mahood, and Chelsea Nagy from the University of Colorado Boulder, and Alexandra Seifert, affiliated with Virtus Wildfire and San Diego State University, and then also Bethany Bradley from UMass Amherst. The paper associated with this presentation was just published and is now available online from Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. So today I'm going to talk a bit about what's driving this grass fire cycle. And we know that invasives can increase fire by providing novel flammable fuels, but that's not really the whole story, at least we don't think. These same invasive grasses also grow near people, and that's important because people are great fire starters, and we provide a lot of ignition sources. So today I'm going to present a new grass fire cycle framework that explicitly incorporates the prevalence of ignition sources near invaded areas. So I am just going to start here with a quick grass fire cycle recap for those of you who might be a little less familiar. And in its simplest form, the grass fire cycle refers to when invasive grasses alter the fuel dynamics within an ecosystem. And this change in fuels is believed to lead to changes in fire regimes. So the new fire regime will favor the invasive grass, either causing things to burn hotter or maybe more frequently, for example. And then the invasive grasses also tend to respond really positively to this fire. And so after a fire moves through, they can take advantage of the disturbance and resprout quickly. And this can lead to further invasion. And fire regimes are generally thought to be driven by three things. So we have ignitions, vegetation, and climate. And when we think about how invasive grasses influence fire regimes, for a really long time, we've been thinking about how the new grass species can put pressure on the vegetation portion of this fire regime triangle. And that makes a lot of sense because after all, grass is vegetation. As another recap, here is a cartoon that's intended to illustrate how cheatgrass invasion can lead to more fire in an invaded sagebrush ecosystem. It has our native sagebrush, invasive cheatgrass, and a match to be our ignition source. And so I've presented this cartoon a few times before to illustrate this change in ecosystem fuel. And focusing on vegetation and fuel change in the science and management communities has led to some really great progress in our understanding of the grass fire cycle. But there's also something a bit odd about what's going on here. And that is this disembodied match that appears to have just floated into my imaginary sagebrush cartoon. And so looking at that, we can start thinking about how a big part of this picture is actually missing. So that brings us back to this fire regime triangle. So yes, invasive grasses are changing vegetation structure, and that's super important, but something important is also happening with the fire ignition sources themselves. So now we have two sides of the triangle to consider, and people are a common link for where this outside pressure is coming from. So invasive species are dispersed by people. They're introduced and spread both accidentally and intentionally by people, and that's something that's really at the core of being a non-native invasive species. And so on the right here, you can see an example that breaks down the introduction pathways of hundreds of invasive plants, including forage crop introductions and ornamental introductions. And this is all important because if a species is introduced by and then often dispersed by people, then the locations of these species are likely going to closely follow human activity. And this idea holds true for fire-prone invasive grass species. So as one example, we have buffalo grass, which was introduced to the southwestern US as cattle forage. And this grass species is still considered favorably in many areas that use it to improve cattle yields. But on the other hand, fast forward 30, 40, 50 years, and we're now starting to see some of the other effects of having buffalo grass on the landscape, where this grass can add a really high intensity burning fuel to desert ecosystems that otherwise would barely have any burnable vegetation. As another example, we have Chinese silvergrass, which is a popular species in the ornamental plant trade. In the graph on the left, you can see Chinese silvergrass in the top left corner. So it was documented as being sold by close to 150 nurseries and other retail outlets, and it is a regulated invasive species in Connecticut. The species is also known to have invasive tendencies in the southeast US, and it's considered a fire hazard there. In addition to this clear link between invasive species and people, we also know that fire ignitions are closely tied with people. In the US, for example, people are responsible for 84% of fire ignitions. In the reddest part of the map here, like in the southeast US or in Mediterranean California, you can see which places fire regimes are being driven almost entirely by human ignition sources. And even in these blue areas, like some parts of the Great Basin and Intermountain West, human ignitions may be present, even if they're not dominant. So really, we need to put these two ideas together. Fire-prone invasive grasses and ignition sources co-occur, and this really matters for driving fire regimes. Here we have this example of cheatgrass, which is a huge problem in the western US, and definitely in Nevada, where this data is taken from. So on the left, we can see that the probability of cheatgrass occurrence decreases as we move away from roads. And on the right, we can see that the density of fires is also highest near these roads in Nevada. And this likely doesn't just apply to cheatgrass and roads in Nevada. So here we have examples of Chinese silvergrass growing near a power line and Japanese stiltgrass growing on a greenway in North Carolina, and then bufflegrass in Arizona growing near a fire pit in a national forest. And these are just a few more examples. So the introduction and spread of these invasives, which have been facilitated by people, put these flammable grasses in some prime locations to then interact with potential ignition sources. So we can go back now to thinking about that simple version of the grass fire cycle from earlier, with just those 4 simple steps where the grass invades, it changes ecosystem fuel properties, those change the ecosystem fire regime, and then the invasive grass is successful under the new fire regime. But this is only really telling about half of the story. Instead, we also need to be thinking about this human component. So the grass is introduced by people, and then people also help it establish and spread, and then people provide these novel ignition sources, and that all feeds into this human grass fire cycle. And conceptually, this is really important because it can help us unlock how to mitigate impacts in places where this has become an issue, and maybe even help us avoid this problem in some places. So by focusing on this more holistic framework, we can direct research and management in a meaningful way. On the research side, we suggest that there are 3 main areas or knowledge gaps that need to be addressed. And so as I'm walking through this, if any of these directions really get the wheels turning in your head, then definitely reach out, because I would be really interested in talking with you and hearing more about what you think. Okay, so we have these 3 main areas we've identified, and we suggest that there's some order to how they should be addressed. So first, we think it's important to just start prioritizing and identifying species and ecosystems that might be relevant to this cycle and really start sussing out their impacts. So this includes just putting together a more comprehensive list of vulnerable ecosystems and potentially problematic species for assessment. And this would also include conducting long-term studies that could track the human grass fire cycle in its entirety and document subsequent impacts. So then expanding on that idea, we think that research should also then start to focus on how other fire regime drivers impact these cycles. And this is where climate change comes in. So one pressing question could be focused on identifying ecosystems where invasive grass species and invasive grass fires are currently limited by climate. and where a changing climate might make those systems more vulnerable. And then finally, with this firmer grasp on which ecosystems and species need priority, and with more context on how they interact with other fire regime drivers, we could focus on management and restoration options that address the human grass fire cycle issue. So just as one example, we could focus on opportunities for prescribed fire and grazing in invasive species and fuels management that expand our understanding of what conditions make those viable options that don't exacerbate invasions. Now, on the management side of things, we think that solutions will need to come from both our invasive species and fire managers. So to provide some examples of that, we have a figure here, and in this figure we have invasion on the y-axis and ignitions on the x-axis. And so for invasions, as we get darker in blue, we're signifying that an invasive grass has become more abundant. And this can happen independently of ignition sources, so these invasive grasses don't necessarily need fire to spread. For ignitions, as we get darker in red, we are talking about places where human ignitions are driving what's happening in a fire regime. And this is regardless of whether or not invasive grasses are present. And then out here in purple is this area that we've been talking about. And this is where high numbers of ignition sources from people and high abundance of invasive grasses have led to this human grass fire cycle that's dominant within an ecosystem. So invasive species and fire managers might take steps to reduce unwanted impacts anywhere along this gradient. And these actions can be proactive or preventative actions before ignitions and grasses are present. They can be reactive to manage fires and invasive grasses directly, or they can be adaptive when ignitions and or grasses are really prevalent. And these adaptive actions are focused on modifying human behaviors to adjust to new ecosystem conditions. And so here now we have some examples of actions that invasive species managers can take that are in blue, like early detection of invasives and working toward regulating potentially problematic species before they arrive. And for fire managers in red, one action they can take is pushing for public outreach programs that focus on ignition prevention. Moving farther out, once invasives and ignitions are present, we have our reactive actions. So these include eradicating invasive populations for invasive species managers and wildland fire suppression and management for fire managers. But we also have an area where our two managers might want to work together in purple, where they can pool their knowledge to identify and remove invasives from fire vulnerable ecosystems and populated areas. And finally, out here on the adaptive side, when we have total vegetation conversion, invasive managers can prioritize removal from important areas, and fire managers can put their efforts to maybe promoting home hardening and fuels reduction. But these two groups can also work together to identify and reduce the use of corridors that promote invasive species and activities that might promote ignition. They can also make sure that maybe invasive species phenology is considered during local fire permitting processes so that we don't have residents doing a lot of local burning when nearby invasives are at their most flammable. All right, so to conclude, we've presented a new human grass fire cycle framework that focuses on this increase in flammable vegetation from invasive grasses, but also this prevalence of ignition sources in areas where invasive grasses are present. And we believe that both of these factors are important in understanding regional changes to fire regimes after invasion, and effective management will need to consider both of these drivers. Thank you all so much for listening. I'd be happy to answer any questions during the Q&A session. And on the bottom left, you'll also see my email, emily.fusco@usda.gov. So please feel free to reach out there if you'd like me to send a copy of the associated paper or if you have any questions that you don't get a chance to ask today.
Great, thank you so much, Emily. I'm going to take a quick look here at the Q&A and the chat. So we have a question from Matt Beyer. In Dan Hankin's talk yesterday, he highlighted how the human fire cycle has always been important throughout human history. As some of the indigenous people have done, maybe we need to think hard about ways to make the cycle work for us rather than fighting against it. I wondered if you had any reflections on that comment, Emily.
Yeah, so certainly there are instances where, application of fire to the landscape is going to be really important for managing and stewarding ecosystems, and thinking about indigenous burning is definitely a great way to be thinking about that. In these cases, I think what we're focused on in this invasive grass fire, this human grass fire cycle, are instances where fires on the landscape in these situations where we don't want it to be, and in a more accidental, unintentional way. And so I think that there's a lot of space to balance this intentional burning and intentional stewardship with, mitigating some of these potential negative impacts that you're going to get when you have unintended fire in some of these systems.
Great, thank you. Emily, I have a question for you, and that is, I know there's been some work in some systems as to kind of breaking down different sources of human ignition, and so that we could have targeted outreach and communication around that. But it does seems to be kind of a diffuse effort across, different areas. And I wondered if you have looked into any of that.
So specific programs?
Well, just kind of studies looking at, I know in Western Oregon, we have a lot of pile burning, and we're actually finding that that's a major ignition source, but it's also how people control a lot of vegetation. So it's an interesting, I guess it's different in each system. So I was just wondering a little bit about kind of thinking about that across systems.
Yeah, so one thing that I would absolutely love to see if it exists in any way is some kind of database that actually looks at specific ignition sources for these grass fires. And so I think the idea that, behind what I just presented is that we know that a lot of these are likely human caused, but there's really this lack of information about, tying these specific causes. So I don't know about a lot of these specific causes and whether we have that at the scale that I'm used to thinking about. But certainly if, any of these folks that have started to put that together at smaller scales, if there's ways to collate that information, that would be incredibly useful for thinking about larger management and outreach objectives.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing anything else in the Q&A or the chat. And so if anyone else would like to put a question or a comment in the Q&A for Emily, you could also, if anyone wants to follow up on the first speaker, Nietupski, please feel free to. We had a comment, I put them in the Q&A about annual forbs that co-occur with Vetnata, a question from Adam Mahood. And Claire Tortorelli responded, great question. Vetnata commonly occurs with both native and non-native annual forbs, including spring draba, Calencia, Colomia, and Clarkia. So we'll just wait another minute here. Thank you, Emily. And our next speaker will be Adam Mahood, just in about a minute, or less, it looks like. Since we have a few seconds, I'm going to remind anyone out there that we do have another session starting tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Eastern time, where we kind of continue our exploration, getting into the weeds. That session, also the last talk of the day, which is a talk I'll be giving, we will be leaving some time for discussion. And then immediately following that session tomorrow, we have our fire circle that we're doing jointly with the special sessions that Matt Brooks organized. So let's go ahead and start our next talk by Adam Mahood. Fuel connectivity, burn severity, and seed bank survivorship drive the grass fire cycle in a semi-arid shrubland.
Okay, so this is a presentation of a chapter of my dissertation that we're just getting published now, where we're kind of looking at the mechanisms of how the grass fire cycle works. And I'm Adam Mahood. I'm at CU Boulder. I'm a postdoc. And anyway, it's just a quick recap of like what is happening in Nevada. There's a lot of sagebrush in Nevada, and that is often being replaced by cheatgrass. And the thing that kind of interested me when I first started doing field work out there is that there's always like a kind of a sharp boundary, or there often is, I guess. And so a lot of times you'll be walking through this like cheatgrass thatch, and then you kind of get to the edge of the sagebrush, and then all of a sudden it's like biological soil crust and like a different floristic composition. So that's why it's kind of thought of as a classic example of an alternative stable state. And so I'm sure a lot of people have already seen all this kind of stuff, but the main idea here, and Emily just went through all this too, is that, you know, the cheatgrass is a lot more flammable than the native vegetation, leads to more frequent fires, and then the cycle continues. And so, but what I was kind of interested in is, how does cheatgrass actually benefit from the fire? Like we know that it definitely does, but like, what is the mechanism by which cheatgrass becomes more dominant after the fire? So so we kind of had an opportunity to explore this question when we were doing a study on the long-term effects of repeated fires. And we went out for our last field trip, and then this huge fire just burned all of our plots. But luckily, if you can see on the right, we still got good results and everything with only 7 study blocks. But so we kind of just like arrived at this area that we were planning on doing long-term fire effects plots, and we just saw a lot of burned area, very recently burned landscape. So one of the things we noticed while we were kind of driving around and just trying to figure out what we were going to do now was that there's a lot of different burn severities going on. So like you can see, this is the fire perimeter here. And you see land use kind of making its way into affecting the burn severity. This is that checkerboard private public pattern that you see along the I-80 corridor. And so we're kind of just driving around, and we reed sampled some of our long-term monitoring plots. So this is our classic example of sagebrush being filled in with cheatgrass. And then here's the repeat photograph 2 weeks later after the fire burned. And we see, high burn severity. But a quick side note is that burn severity is not fire temperature, which kind of becomes important because in a lot of areas, burn severity and fire intensity are highly correlated, but not all the time. And so here, this is probably high temperatures and high burn severity. But with cheatgrass, a lot of times you have, one Landsat pixel will have 100% of the vegetation burned, but it just didn't really burn that hot. And so here you can see all these cheatgrass seeds all over the place. And then my crappy plastic stake that I had in this plot is still just like kind of singed. So it's not even hot enough to burn my like cheap plastic stakes. So as we were driving around, we kind of noticed that it also didn't really matter that much about the floristic composition when we were looking at all these different burned areas, because we had just been doing all this work in this burned scar before it burned. So we kind of knew what was there before. And so, and it was really just about the fuel structure rather than the composition. And so eventually we decided that it was kind of a perfect opportunity to do a seed bank study. So the seed bank is kind of like this key demographic stage in, the whole grass fire cycle, especially in the Great Basin, because all of the invasive species are pretty much annual. And a lot of the natives are also perennial seed obligate. So the seed stage is really key. And so that kind of gets at that mechanism question. Maybe the native seeds aren't as adapted to fire and the invasive seeds are. And so if you get that differential impact of the fire on the seed bank, then you would have your kind of mechanism of how exactly the cheatgrass benefits from fire. And so that leads us to our kind of three hypotheses that we had to kind of tie it all together. First was that fuel conductivity will increase the burn severity. And so here, if you're not sure what fuel conductivity looks like, that's here in the foreground. And then if you want to see what burn severity looks like, in the background here, we have this entire mountain that's just completely burned by this fire that just happened. So this is kind of like when we arrived at our field plots, and we were planning on doing all these plots on this mountain, and then we saw this, and then we were like, well, that's not going to work. So anyways, so then our second hypothesis is that burn severity will favor the fire tolerant species in its seed bank. And then that third hypothesis is that it'll loop around and there will be more fire tolerant species, or the higher prevalence of fire tolerant species in the seed bank will lead to higher post-fire fuel continuity or connectivity. So here's our kind of theoretical diagram. And another thing I want to note is that these three variables are all continuous variables. They're all easy to measure. Even the species composition of the seed bank isn't fast to measure, but it's still easy. You just pluck the little seeds out, but it takes weeks and weeks and weeks. But they're all easy to measure, and it's theoretically easy to make models that you can kind of turn the dials on with this kind of theoretical model. So you could maybe envision doing some kind of Martin Sheffer style studies where you come up with thresholds and stuff. So easy to measure. So we went out, measured this stuff. We measured the seed bank. We sampled the seed bank on both sides of the fire perimeter at 14 locations, and basically just got as many samples as we could until we ran out of time. And then luckily, that was the exact amount to fill up an entire greenhouse bench, which was all the space that the greenhouse people were willing to give us, because as I said before, this was an accidental study. And so we were kind of last minute begging for people to let us put our soil samples in the freezer and let us use their greenhouse space. And so, but we got really lucky with graciousness of everybody. And so we germinated the seeds from all these samples and individually plucked out every single seedling and identified it and counted it. And then the next year we came back immediately and measured the total vegetation cover of each side of the fire perimeter. And then we went back 3 years later to kind of capture what the system looked like after that initial period of instability, once everything kind of turned into cheatgrass. So just to make sure that it did indeed turn into cheatgrass, which it did. And so, yeah, so that's basically actually some pretty quick field work once we did the seed bank stuff. And so here are our results. So first hypothesis, the burn severity will be positively affected by pre-fire fuel conductivity. So our field plots, we ended up getting kind of like not overly amazingly significant results, but this is kind of expected because these are messy pixels. The seed bank was sampled and the vegetation cover was directly measured right at the edge of the fire. So these 30-meter Landsat pixels, you would imagine, are not going to be exactly lined up with the fire perimeter. So, and also burn severity is not solely controlled by vegetation structure. It's also controlled by climate and, daily weather. So you kind of expect an inherently messy signal if you're only looking at total vegetation cover. And we are kind of our inherent flaw in our sampling design in hindsight. So we did a little supplementary analysis where we modeled the total vegetation cover using some vegetation indices along with BLM AIM data, and we did the predictions onto the fire. And then we did a we looked at the relationship between burn severity and the model total vegetation cover of this fire. And lo and behold, a nice, significant positive, but also kind of messy relationship as we expected. Next, so looking at the composition of the seed bank, we did a Bayesian joint species distribution model on the probability of occurrence of all of the seeds of all the species that occurred at two or more sampling locations. And so, as you can see here, all of the non-native, or what am I trying to say here? On the top is the non-native, on the bottom is the native. And almost every species is either has a nice strong negative relationship or has a positive relationship that doesn't get above 50%. And so those are I'm kind of arguing that the data is saying that these are not fire tolerant. And then these two species, cheatgrass and tubble mustard, have a nice positive relationship that gets above 50%, just about 50%, maybe for Cimbrium. And so we're saying these are the fire tolerant species.
You have about 5 minutes.
Oh, thank you. And then, so yeah, I successfully rushed through the first part of the presentation. And then, so then a third hypothesis here is that post-fire fuel connectivity will be positively influenced by the density of fire tolerant seeds in the seed bank. And so here you have cheatgrass seeds and a nice positive relationship between that and post-fire fuel connectivity. So, and that's it. Just those three things. And so we found pretty good evidence for this positive feedback loop. And I think it's perhaps gives us an opportunity to do some pretty cool modeling with these mechanistic variables. Each of these variables represents a continuous variable that's easy to measure, that represents like an inherent mechanism of the grass fire cycle. So this kind of might allow you to, get into some mathematical statistics, do some predictions of state changes, try to do early warning signals and threshold estimation. Like one of the things that comes to my mind is like, interannual variability is really important in these systems. And so you could use like near real time estimations of cheatgrass cover to kind of say, you could, look at figure out the threshold of cheatgrass cover where that's going to lead to higher burn severity. And then, you could use that to identify areas in real time where they're going to be more vulnerable to state change, such as this. So, but yeah, that's just like spitballing. That's early stages of next step thinking about. And management implications, it's hard to say, because management actions often just end up busting the crust and introducing more invasives. However, the land management methodology is improving and people are getting a lot better and understanding these things a lot better. So I'll leave that to the land managers to decide if this helps them or not. But one of the things that I really think this points to for me is that is to maximize the unburned patches within fire perimeters if that's logistically feasible, because those seed obligate perennial natives are super important for post-fire establishment. And yeah, to me, that just seems like the most obvious thing to me for any kind of management recommendation. So that's it. That's my talk. Thanks for bearing with me on the technical difficulties. Just want to acknowledge my research assistants who kind of came with me and helped me out with all my half-baked ideas on this like accidental opportunistic study, and then all my little small grants that I got to barely fund the field trips that I went out to do. So thank you so much, and I'll leave it open for questions.
Great, thank you very much, Adam. I see we have one question right now, and that is, how did you measure DNBR? For example, when was the pre and post fire period, and how did this reflect the burn severity you saw on the ground?
I think, well, so the pre-fire scene, I think was like mid-June or something like that, like pretty close to right before the fire. And then the post-fire scene was actually pretty close to being after the fire. And to me, it looks like pretty close. Like, for example, in that checkerboard pattern is actually directly correlated to places where the BLM does this thing where they kind of plow rows. And so like in all those areas, there's still like kind of not a lot of like cheatgrass thatch. It's kind of like long standing, like increased bare ground from that like management technique that they used to do. And so, so yeah, to me, it seemed like pretty close. What I actually used, to be honest, though, was just the MTBS like pre-packaged DNBR scene. But I also just calculated the RDNBR and the DNBR for a bunch of different ways. And then at the end of it, I was like, screw it, I'll just use MTBS. It doesn't really matter. So
Great, thank you. We need to move on to our next talk. Hopefully, Adam, you can join the fire circle and any other questions at that time. And that question was actually from Claire Tortorelli. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Matt Reeves, and he'll be talking about forecasting rangeland fuels and the impact of invasive annuals.
Hi, Becky. Can you hear me?
We can hear you great, Matt. Thank you.
Swell. Well, thanks for that radio check. I was a bit nervous after some of the Zoom technicalities, but here we are. Good. I'll get started. Let me share my screen and get started here. Share. Tell me if you can see it.
Yep, you might want to put it on presentation mode. Yep, there you go.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining me today, everybody. And as Becky said, we're going to be talking about forecasting rangeland fuels and explore some of the impacts of invasive annuals. I have to say I've learned a lot in this, the whole conference, but definitely in this session as well. And I think that this work I'm about to present dovetails pretty nicely with what's been said already. My name's Matt Reeves. I do work with the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Missoula, Montana, and I focus exclusively on rangeland issues. So we're going to be talking today about our system called fuelcast.net, but first I would like to talk a bit about why we started this work. And first, it was very obvious to me, we spend weeks and millions of dollars to get poor calibration results for a lot of our fire behavior simulations, either tactically or strategically. And I was once the land fire fuels team leader. And in that time, I discovered the significance of not having properly calibrated fuels. So that's one reason. The other reason we wanted to embark on this project is we felt that if we had a better understanding of what the fuels might look like in the near future, this would lead to increased safety and better projections of fire behavior and, of course, of large wildfire probability. But driving a lot of this difficulty, as Adam had mentioned, is the variability in fuels year to year, which is shown in this picture. This is fine fuel yield from 1984 to 2021, and its variability. So in this case, it's a percent, and the warm tones would mean, as an example, the warmest tone, 185 to 408%. That means on an interannual basis, the fuels in those red colored areas can vary 200, 300, 400% in a given year, say to 2 to 4 to 6 to 800 pounds per acre of yield, depending on the year. Whereas the cool tones are more boring, usually because of shrubs, but there's some other things going on in the cool tones that make the fuel beds much more stable over time. And you can envision, for example, this Sonoran Desert scene here where we have year to year tremendous differences in what the fuel beds might look like. And most of our systems today struggle to capture this kind of information on a spatially explicit basis in a timely manner. Now, when we talk about, as many have discussed already in this conference, when we talk about invasives, there are many to be considered. Two that are hot on our radar, of course, would be red brome and cheatgrass. No need to introduce either of these, but as you can see, and as Adam had mentioned previously, they fill in the interstitial spaces between the shrubs and create a lot of problems. And, you know, we might be asking the question, so what about these? So what if we replace Poa secunda, you know, Sandberg's bluegrass, let's say, with cheatgrass? What's going on? Well, the high surface area to volume means that a lot of these invasives are much more flammable than a number of our invasive or our native species. And there'd been a lot of work done in the 80s and 90s that talks about those surface area to volume ratios. And overall, we've documented since 1984 very substantial increase in yields, not only in the sage steppe ecosystem as a whole, but also out into the northern Great Plains, albeit for different reasons. But one of the main things we see in terms of overall fuel yield is when we introduce these invasive annuals, oftentimes it's a positive if you're a fire because it increases the fuel yield and again makes it a more flammable situation. And as we said, it fills in the interstitial spaces. And, you know, depending on who you talk to, we really don't have systems today that are tracking this kind of phenomena, at least in a projection mode. And so let's pivot back briefly to the Sonoran Desert picture. What's really driving a lot of the interannual variability and a lot of that increased flammability is exactly what you see in the picture here with the red brome. That should not be there for those of you that haven't got that yet in this breakout session here. That herbaceous yield of those invasives should not be there in this system, and it's causing problems. So recognizing all of this, we developed what we call our FuelCast system. And with our current data pipeline, I'm going to walk you through briefly how we do it. But it is a deployed artificial intelligence application on Google Earth Engine. And you can Google fuelcast.net if you want. The viewer kind of stinks. We're working on it, but the algorithm is robust. Now, up until 2022, we had been running in weekly mode. Nobody really uses weekly data. I'm not sure we need to produce it. Plus, it's costing me a lot of money out of my pocket. So I think in 2022, we're going to switch to just bi-weekly. I think that should be enough. But what we're projecting is the yield in the growing season, or the expected yield in the growing season. To do that, we use the eModus or the expedited modus, which is something we push to Google Cloud Storage. We use GridMet, which is precipitation, that's daily, and the Eddy drought formulation. And these are already on Earth Engine, so you can have access to those yourself. The algorithm that's used sounds like a terrible disease, but it's called the fully convoluted deep neural network. It's one of the main algorithms available on Google Earth for this type of projection work. And now, after 2 years of discussing and battling sometimes with the CIO, we're now fully automated, so it does not require as much human interaction to make it run every 2 weeks. So when does it run? Well, the system starts 4 months ahead of the peak. So if you can imagine this phenology of northern Great Plains mixed grass prairie peaking about June 15th, if we subtract 4 months from that, in this instance, at that pixel location, the fuel caster, the FuelCast system would start at about February 15th. So it starts at every pixel 4 months ahead of the peak. So where do the invasive species come in and how do we treat them? Well, recognizing all the great work that's being done by very many other organizations, we opted to not try and go find our own system to predict where these are occurring. Instead, we're relying on 2 other systems to tell us or inform us where these invasive species are occurring. One is the USGS system that some of you may or may not be aware of. It is tracking 17 of these invasives. I did confirm this with Stephen Boyd, who is the leader of this team here. He did say there's 17 species that they track, and they do that twice a year. So they give us a snapshot of where they are detecting cover of these different species. So we use that. But we could also use the rangeland analysis platform that puts out the amount of annual herbaceous cover. It does not break out invasives, just annual herbaceous. Now, this is more of a retrospective product than the USGS one, but we leverage both kinds of information here to tell us something about the expected yield. And I'll show you how we do that in just a second. I want to run through briefly our product line. We have the weekly 1 hour fuel yield that's going to be bi-weekly in 2022, but that's the projected yield in pounds per acre, also the percentage change. But then the annual herbaceous yield in pounds per acre and the percent change. So that's where the sesimbriums and the red brome and the cheatgrass, perhaps even ventonata someday, et cetera. That's where that would come in. Unique to our project, we're doing biweekly estimates here of the surface fire behavior fuel model, the Scott and Bergen kind, and the formulation of standing dead. So we keep track of these things biweekly. And I'm going to show you here in just a second why that's such a big deal. Putting it all together, and this is kind of where the invasives come in, we make our AI application do the 4-month prediction ahead of time. Then we leverage the USGS or the RAP rangeland analysis platform annual herbaceous information to kind of help us scale the production estimate accordingly. So we might say there's 1,000 pounds being projected because of precip, because of the NDVI, because of the eddy, and we attribute that fuel yield to the annual herbaceous according to these other data sets. So we don't do it ourselves. We allow these other data sets to influence that. And then of course we keep track of the standing dead, and that's going to help come up with an expected total fuel yield during the growing season at the peak of the growing season. And that's a very big issue. I want to run now into some application, just briefly talk about, what do you do with this? How do you even make sense of it? Well, if you know, this year there was tremendous reversal in vegetation conditions in the Southwest. As you can see by this map, which is September 1 vegetation percentile conditions. And as you can see, more than a third of the state of Arizona had 90th percentile vegetation conditions. There are some monster yields being recorded right now in these blue areas. And that's very important because there's going to be a lot of standing dead coming into 2022 right out of the gate. Now, how much of this is from invasives? It's a good question. We're still trying to figure all that out. I would add, though, that fire is a poor botanist, as Mark Finney is fond of saying. And this is going to create some fire problems, no matter if it's an invasive species or some other kind of annual. Bottom line, there's a ton of standing dead on the ground right now in the desert Southwest from these monsoons. Well, let's walk through what that might look like in this picture here. So in 2021, on average, a lot of those areas you saw in blue ended up with 200 to 300% increases in fuels. So let's say we're talking somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds per acre. But just for demonstration purposes, let's say it's average about 800 pounds per acre. Keep in mind, that's going to be fully cured coming into 2022. So our standing dead is 800 pounds coming into 2022. If we have an average year, we're looking at about 250 pounds of additional production on top of that. So we're roughly 1050 to 1100 pounds per acre of fine fuel. Okay, so how does that play out compared to a normal year? With some crude very crude calculations, just to make the point, on the X is mid-flame wind speed, on the Y is flame length. In a normal year, we're in the blue, maybe a foot or less, let's say, in the Sonoran Desert kind of ecosystem. But when we take into account the tremendous standing dead that's happened, much of it from invasives, we've got a 10-fold increase in flame length already expected just from the standing dead component with even an average year coming into 2022. Ditto with spread rate. Look at the spread rate here. On average, it's a real dog. You're looking at 5 to 10 chains per hour. And with the addition of the standing dead we're seeing now, you're going to easily get a 10-fold increase with a wind limit here of about 150 chains per hour. And again, this is just demonstration purposes of the importance of the standing dead and the annual component here. Well, you're probably wondering, as I have often done so myself, does this thing even work, and how and where does it work? The bottom line is it works very well in some areas and it doesn't work worth a darn in others. And we're trying to document that for users. But in 2020, the fires that had occurred by July 28th had a very strong affinity for the fuel cast information, suggesting way higher than average yield indicated by the cool tones here. So fires tend to have some affinity for where we were pegging the fuels. Now, the areas in white are forested. We don't deal with that, just the non-forest. So we felt good about that result. And then this year, starting in March, we were pounding the table, and we even said in our Fuelcast podcast on April 26th that 82% of US ranges are projected to have negative yields. And in the areas in red, with the exception of the Southwest, those panned out to be pretty well true. There was a lot of reductions of the grasses, especially this year in those red circles. So we felt, again, very positive about that outcome. Now, if all of this seems a little confusing and you don't want to mess with it, you don't want to download any information, they are just as geotiffs biweekly. The standing dead would be an annual product, so there's just one per year. But if you fish around in the Fuelcast system there, you'll find there's some data you can play with. And if you have questions, sure, let us know. But if you're confused, you don't know where else to go, you can always tune in to our Reading the Tea Leaves, which is our assessment of, it's a podcast, and it is monthly plus or minus. We make it 7 minutes or less, and we try and tell you what we think the system is telling us. So what the conditions
about
are probably.
5 minutes, Matt.
Got it. Thank you. And we focus on going around the country and interpreting what we think is happening. And we also attribute, not only what is happening, but why it's happening. Is it because of soil moisture increase or deficit that we're seeing the yield expectations? Is it precip? Is it the eddy product that's driving the bus? So we kind of give you a sense of not only what the system is telling us, are we going to have above average or below average, but we try and also say what we think the causality might be. And in many cases, of course, it's, has it rained or not? But it's not always that simple. Okay, I want to wrap up and just thank you all for joining me. And I want to remind you that if you do have an interest in participating or listening to our podcast or webcast and participating in that, you can do that. Just get a hold of me and I'll put you in the constant contact system. That'll be starting monthly in 2022. And I'll be happy to help you set up if you have an interest. Let's say you're doing some kind of fire behavior assessment. Maybe you're doing some kind of projections and you want to understand more about what we think the fuel beds are going to look like in 2022. And you want to do that in an automated way and run your models with these kinds of information, let me know and I'll be happy to help you get started with our API there and help you overcome any obstacles you have. But it is on the Google Earth Engine, so it's easier if people have their system operating there, but we can also help you perform well in other environments if that's needed. So make sure to catch me at matthew.reeves@usda.gov. And I hope that you are getting as much out of these presentations in the last hour or two as I have. So thank you. I'll entertain any questions you have.
Thanks a bunch, Matt. Great talk. We have a couple questions here from Adam Mahood. Does Fuelcast have any plans to go global?
Well, we've certainly talked about that and would be willing to entertain the idea. We've penciled it out to see what that might look like. And, computationally, it's not a big lift. The data sets to drive it, we would have to switch a little bit. So we'd have to go with, for example, SMAP, the soil moisture, which would be a global product, which would be a predictor of the yield as opposed to eddy or something else. So we just would need to make sure that whatever we use, the data to drive it would be globally. The Air Force, of course, has some global rainfall data that could be used and other things. We've definitely thought about it. Right now, there's no concrete plans for it. On the one hand, I'd have to ensure there would be people that had an interest in it before we made the investment, because it's not cheap to set it up.
Yeah. And we have a talk from Claire Tortorelli, and it kind of occurred to me that we can have people ask their own questions if they want. But Claire asked, great talk, Matt. Are these projections restricted to rangelands, or do they also cover burned, disturbed forests where canopy has been lost?
Nope, they're strictly non-forest. They could be pivoted to what we might consider transitional rangelands, as you've mentioned, where let's say the forest gets wiped out and we get a bunch of thistles and whatever else to come back. The thing could be trained on anything we wish. So if there was a desire to do that, we could look at it. We would just have to have a way of telling it, hey, this is where you need to look this year. Right now, it just does pasture and anything less than 25% canopy cover of trees.
Okay. So I guess you could bring in like an annual or semi-annual estimate of canopy cover to then kind of mask that potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. We could say you could bring in, either the NLCD, the USGS, or the RAP forest canopy cover, and you could say, here's where the canopy cover is small, anywhere that it's less than X but was Y. Start your engines. The trouble with that is that you won't have a time series in that system to train the model on. We allow up to 2 years worth of antecedent conditions to influence the projection for this year. But if you don't have a long time series for the left hand side, which you wouldn't if it was a recent burn, because it's only been burned recently, then it would be a weird model.
Yeah.
So we'd have to figure that out.
That's a great point. Thank you, Matt. We're going to pivot to our next talk, which is Claire Tortorelli, who will be speaking about feeding the fire, modeling annual grass invasion in a forest mosaic landscape.
Great, thanks, Becky. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. And can you see the presentation mode there?
Looks great, Claire.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, excited to be giving a talk today in this awesome session, and it's been great to follow these fantastic talks, and they provided a lot of great background information too. So I'll be kind of skipping through some of that. But anyway, my name is Claire Tortorelli. I'm a PhD student at Oregon State University, and I mostly research grass invasions in kind of forest mosaic ecosystems. And so this talk today is going to be focused on modeling annual grass invasion, a recent invader called Bentonata in one of those forest mosaic landscapes of Eastern Oregon. So before I get going, I just want to give a quick thank you and shout out to all the wonderful people, my advisors, lab group, botany, stats, fire modeling, and field gurus and funders that have made this project possible. So thank you. So many of you are well aware that the influence that invasions can have on fuels and fire. We've heard a whole lot of talks about it between our session and Brooke's session earlier. And these relationships are super well documented in fire-sensitive ecosystems, such as the sage steppe, where, as you know, positive invasion fire feedbacks often lead to the loss of native species, ecosystem function, and structure. And while these grass fire cycles are common throughout the Western United States, for example, we've heard about cheatgrass and red brome in the Southwest and the Great Basin. I haven't heard today too much about, but also problematic invasive annuals in the California chaparral or Mediterranean regions. And while these kind of grass fire cycles have done a lot of ecosystem transformation in these semi-arid and arid regions, Western forests, such as the Blue Mountains, circled here, have remained relatively resistant to invasions despite the presence of invaders in these nearby areas. However, a recent invasion by this rapidly spreading invasive annual grass called Bentonata dubia or Bentonata may be challenging those previous conceptions of resistance and resilience, especially where it invades inland Northwest forest mosaic landscapes. So I'm just going to show you a couple photos here of areas that Bentonata commonly invades, these rocky forest openings that prior to invasion were sparsely vegetated, were historically fire and invasion resistant, as you can see, maybe even more so than some of those great sagebrush, those big sagebrush systems. These areas have very low fuel loads, They're very sparsely vegetated, and even the shrubs are quite small. When Ventonata invades, just like cheatgrass, we're seeing increases in fuel loads and connectivity between the shrubs and shallow-rooted bunch grasses like Poa secunda. And that can lead to burning in these previously fire-resistant communities. And just like in other areas, this can have big impacts on biodiversity, especially for those species that didn't evolve with frequent fire and might not be adapted to recover quickly after fire. And for fire management, I'm going to show you a very quick video here taken by friend and colleague Will Downing, smoke jumping into one of these non-forest scabland or dwarf shrubland patches within a larger forested mosaic landscape. And you can see they're using this non-forest patch as a firefighter safety and landing zone to access this forest fire that's burning in the nearby forest. And at the time of this video being taken, this scabland or dwarf shrubland patch is not invaded. And so there aren't a lot of fuels there to carry that fire through this patch. It's kind of acting as a natural fire break. But you can imagine if invasion was to affect this system, if this patch was to become invaded, those fuels might actually carry that fire from the nearby forest across this patch into the surrounding area. And you might have a much larger fire on your hands. So in order to understand how fire it's important to understand how this Ventonata invasion might be influencing local, so within an invaded patch and landscape scale fire behavior in order to plan for fire and fuel managements across this recently invaded landscape. That's what we're going to focus on today, is really what are the impacts of invasion on these local and landscape scales. And so the Blue Mountain ecoregion provides really the perfect place to address this question because it's comprised of that patchwork mosaic of forest and non-forest ecosystems, of which many of the non-forested areas are heavily invaded by Ventonata. So I have two figures here. The one on the left shows that Blue Mountain ecoregion and the diversity of vegetation types that it's comprised of, and then a zoomed in image on the right showing that an aerial view of those forest mosaics and with the orange shading indicating areas that are invaded with Ventonata. But because this is such a large landscape, Ventonata is a relatively recent invader. That's resulted in really few locations where Ventonata invasion has intersected with fires on the ground. So we chose to use a simulation approach to model how Ventonata influences burning over thousands of simulated years. And to do this, we used the Large Fire Simulator, or FSIM, which uses topography, weather, and fuels, along with historical emissions, fire size, and fire suppression model to generate thousands of fire seasons, which allows it to capture a long enough period to generate burn probabilities for the given landscape. And along with that gridded raster file of annual burn probabilities, FSIM also outputs a flame length exceedance probability, which is the probability of flame lengths occurring within 6 flame length categories if a pixel is to burn. And it outputs shape files for every perimeter, for every simulated fire perimeter and their corresponding emission locations. And for the purpose of this study, we were really just interested in the probability of flame length exceeding 1.2 meters or 4 feet, as this is really a measure of fire intensity that reflects kind of the tipping point at which fire suppression is no longer likely to be contained by hand line alone and might switch to being, might be necessary to bring in some machinery and dozers to contain that fire. So for the rest of the study, when I talk about flame length exceedance probability or increasing flame lengths, we're talking about that 1.2 meter or 4 foot threshold. But to examine how invasion influenced simulated burn probability and fire behavior, we first needed to create 2 fuelscapes that represented the ecoregion with invasion and without to feed into FSIM. And since the existing fuelscapes available from fuel product databases such as Landfire did not appear to accurately reflect fuels in our invaded and uninvaded regions, we started with the Landfire fuel products, but we modified fuels in uninvaded and invaded areas to create custom fuelscapes for the purpose of this study. So very briefly, for our uninvaded fuelscape, we created this by identifying vegetation types across the ecoregion that have very low productivity when uninvaded, just those dwarf shrublands, and modifying fuels in these areas by choosing representative fuel models to reflect the expected low fuel loads. And then we took that uninvaded fuelscape and we altered it by assigning areas predicted to be invaded with ventonata to fuel models that better represented the increased fine fuel loads and connectivity characteristic of invaded areas. And these invaded areas were identified using a ventonata species distribution model developed in a previous study that Ty mentioned, or Ty presented on earlier in this session. So although ventonata invaded many vegetation types, as we've seen before, we only increased fuels in historically low productivity vegetation types because with that, these are the areas where we expected ventonata to have the greatest impact on fuels and fire behavior, as in that dwarf shrubland pictured here.
Claire, can you make sure you're speaking right into your microphone? When you turn your head, we're losing you a little bit.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
So in total, we increased fuels in 2.5% of the whole landscape to represent invasion in those historically low productivity vegetation types. But to understand the effect that invasion-induced fuel shifts have on ecoregion burn probability and fire behavior, we then ran FSIM with those two fuelscapes, the uninvaded and the invaded, and with all other input variables held constant, including ignitions and weather. And that allowed us to directly compare the simulated fire outputs, with the only thing changing being those fuels. And so now to show you some results. When we looked at this probability density function, or really just a smooth histogram of annual burn probability and flame lengths for the burn, for the invaded systems, which are indicated by the black lines and black triangles, and the orange systems, we saw shifts in the median, which are indicated by these vertical lines, and the means, which are indicated by triangles, in annual burn probability and flame lengths for all vegetation types, but generally these shifts were very, very small. And this is to be expected considering that we only modified 2.5% of the whole landscape. We wouldn't expect that small changes in fuels to drastically increase burn probability and flame lengths for the entire ecoregion. But we did find the greatest impacts invasions and burn probability in the dwarf shrubland, which is also to be expected because these are areas where we generally we're increasing fuels to represent that invasion. And these were pretty meaningful. We saw pretty large increases in annual burn probability, and we saw evidence that flame lengths were shifting from generally below 40 or 50% to above 60%, indicating a potential shift in suppression activity for these invaded dwarf shrublands. So our second question was about how invasion influences fire spread. So despite many of these vegetation types showing really minimal shifts in fire behavior at that ecoregion scale, uninvaded areas might be more heavily impacted by invasion when they exist in close proximity to invaded patches. So we're zooming in now from the ecoregion to these smaller landscapes. So for example, when evaluating fire perimeters in the uninvaded landscape, we might see little fire spread between the uninvaded and the invaded vegetation types or across ecotones if those uninvaded patches can't carry fire if they don't have enough fuels. But when invasion increases fuel loads and connectivity in these patches, we might see increased fire spread between the uninvaded and invaded areas as pictured in B. And so to answer this question, we measured the area burned in each vegetation type from every simulated fire perimeter and compared that to the vegetation type that the fire's ignition occurred in. And that's going to be shown here in this grid, where we have on the left, the vegetation type where the fires were ignited, and on the right, on the bottom there, the area that the fire spread into. And what we found was that in the invaded scenario, we saw in general, fires ignited in dwarf shrublands spread into and burned 15% more closed and open tree canopy. So that's area, 15% more area in the invaded scenario than the uninvaded scenario. And we saw that fires igniting in open and closed tree canopy were burning on average about 20% more dwarf shrubland. And burning within dwarf shrublands, so just fires ignited in dwarf shrubland that burned dwarf shrubland the area increased by 28%. So we're seeing pretty large increases in the area burned, the annual area burned because of invasion in these systems. especially because of that spread between predominantly that dwarf shrubland and the closed and open canopy forest. So what does this increase in fire spread mean for burn probability and fire behavior in uninvaded forests? And to answer this, we examined how the proportion of invasion in a 16-hectare neighborhood surrounding a focal forested pixel, like the one pictured here, influenced the difference in burn probability and flame length exceedance probability for the uninvaded forest pixel located in the center of the neighborhood. So we looked at neighborhoods that varied in proportion of uninvaded from 0 to 100%. So kind of what we see pictured here is a neighborhood that has about 50% invasion. And we saw that, as expected, as the proportion of neighborhood invaded increased, we saw larger differences in the annual burn probability and flame length exceedance probability between the invaded and uninvaded simulations. For example, if 50% of the neighborhood was invaded, as is indicated by this dotted red line, we would see a 28% increase in the difference in burn probability over a century. And so this is really measuring the difference in annual burn probability, so the invaded scenario minus uninvaded scenario for each of those focal forested pixels. And at that same landscape, when you have about 15% invade, 50% of the landscape invaded, that burn probability, the flame length exceedance probability is only expected to increase about 9%.
You have about 5 minutes, Claire.
Okay, thanks, Becky. Only seeing about a 9% increase of the probability of going from that below 4-foot category to above 5-foot category. So this indicates that while we're seeing much higher likelihoods of those forested pixels burning, they're not that much more likely to burn at higher severity. So to wrap it all up, in summary, we saw invasion increase burn probability and flame length in historically low productivity vegetation types, primarily those dwarf shrublands, where we increased fuels. And that ventonata invasion may alter fuels in about 2.5% of the entire ecoregion. And so that's not that much of the ecoregion, but we are seeing that that historically low productivity vegetation type encompasses more like 15% of the ecoregion. And those areas are highly susceptible to ventonata invasion. So we might see larger impacts as more of this landscape becomes invaded, if more of this landscape becomes invaded in the future. We saw that forests and landscapes can experience altered burn probability and fire behavior if their neighborhood is invaded, and this is likely due because of the increased fire spread between forests and invaded patches. Some ecological implications for this work are that increased fire activity in historically fire-resistant vegetation types may remove sagebrush and initiate state shifts, especially, like we said, like in the Great Basin in these sagebrush systems. And greater fire spread between patches may lead to more frequent low or moderate severity fires in forests. And while this increased fire frequency may promote desired forest structure, because a lot of these dry systems evolved with more frequent fire regimes, and some management strategies are attempting to kind of restore some of that more frequent fire into these forests. However, if that more frequent fire is fueled by nearby invasions, post-fire invasions because of suppression activities or because of just spread into forests after fire, could reduce especially understory diversity, but may even impede forest recovery where you're getting canopy loss and you're expecting those tree seedlings to recover after fire. They might be outcompeted by some of these invasives. And finally, just a few management implications to think about. You might want to rethink fuel treatment locations and management strategies near dwarf shrublands. So it's kind of common practice in these areas to use some of these dwarf shrublands prior to invasion as that natural fire break and pair that with a fuel treatment in the nearby forests to kind of increase the effectiveness of that treatment, but that might not, they're finding that in these areas, those treatments are actually less effective now that those nearby non-forest patches are invaded. So we have fewer natural fire breaks, which also could lead to fewer firefighter access and safety zones. Hand lines may be less effective in invaded patches, because we saw that flame length exceedance probability increasing to above 50% in these areas. And this could increase demand on machinery if now we need dozers or larger machinery to suppress fires in non-forest patches, which may exacerbate invasion because we know that some of those dozer lines can be sources, can increase property pressure and are easily invaded. And finally, you might want to consider some fine fuel treatments along with woody fuel treatments to decrease fuel continuity and fire hazard. And thank you. I'm looking forward to any questions.
Thank you, Claire. That was really appreciate your talk. We've had some great talks in this session. I'm going to look, check here. I am not seeing any questions, so please go ahead. Folks in the audience and others, go ahead and any questions you have in the Q&A or the chat for Claire. One thing I wanted to point out is I believe that this is the first time we've really used something like the large fire simulator, FSIM, to look at changes in burn probability across very large landscapes. And so this is a tool that's been used in a variety of tactical and strategic fire suppression and fuel treatment types of applications, but we haven't really used it similarly to look at invasive species and fire. And so it's kind of an interesting approach to answer some of these questions. See, I'm not seeing any questions. Oh, here's one. Claire, thanks for the presentation. Sounds like a difficult situation to manage. Do you know if pre-emergent herbicides are effective?
If they're effective on Vencinata, I think there are some pre-emergent herbicides that have been found to be effective. I'm not sure if they're federally approved, all of them. But I think the problem with these landscapes is it's just such a large scale that it would be such an undertaking to try to herbicide all of these invasive patches. So we're doing some additional analyses to look at the influence of patch size and other kind of landscape spatial factors to narrow down areas where invasion is having the largest effect on nearby fire behavior in nearby forests. So hopefully some of that information could help kind of target those herbicide applications if they work and if they become approved.
Great, thank you. Let's see. I don't see any other questions, and we're a little bit over our time, and so I'm going to just wrap up here. Just great talks. All the talks were great in this session. Thank you so much to the folks who presented today and their collaborators. And I just wanted to add, we have one other special session on getting into the weeds. It's tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Eastern time. And then that will be followed. That session is followed by the Fire Circle we'll be doing jointly with the special sessions that Matt Brooks and I organized around relationships between invasive plants and fire management. And I hope all of you can pop into all of that, and it's an opportunity to continue to engage and ask questions. And I'll say thank you and hand it back over to our producer.
Thank you, Becky. Appreciate it. And thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your expertise with us today. This session will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. Up next, starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, is our afternoon plenary featuring keynote speakers Kevin Ayers, wildland fire scientist of Tall Timbers Research Station, and Sally Archibald, University of the Witwatersrand professor at the School of Animal, Plant, and Environmental Sciences. We will also announce the winners of the AFE Lifetime Achievement Awards. To access this session, use the agenda tab to the left of your screen. Click Sessions and click the main session to join. Thanks again to our speakers and enjoy the rest of your day.